Hey everyone, this is Kimber.
I'm Will.
We are Crossfire Co-op, and we have a very special guest today for this episode of Ricochet, otherwise known as Caught in the Crossfire. This is Matthew, otherwise known as Novastar.
From SaberCombat.com. Let's get suited up.
Sounds good. Welcome to a very special episode of Ricochet.
Now that's fun, right? Got the costumes, got the sabers, got Kimber and Will here. I'm Novastar, by the way.
That's right.
And I guess we'll have a little fun today.
Yeah. We wanted to first ask you, how did you get started with all of this awesomeness?
So that's a really good question. It's probably pretty multifaceted, but I'll try to sum it up as best I can. So just about 10 years ago, so that would be about 2005 and 2006, I was teaching fencing. I'm a fencing instructor. I've been a competitive fencer for many years. I have my share of golds and silvers and bronzes and blah, 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 blah. I'd also done martial arts and theater and film and all this, but you know, I would do some theater productions here and etc. and just, I don't know, kind of out of a whim. This is even before the episode 3 movie was coming out. This was, you know, episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. I was thinking to myself, and I don't know, I was just in some discussions with friends and I went, you know, I've never seen a live lightsaber performance. I mean, I've seen some people come out and do little demos and be like, look, we're cool in costume, we've got cool lightsabers. And even those were really sparse and sometimes very dim and, you know, not very exciting looking. And so I was talking to some of my friends. I'm like, you know, yeah, I wonder what it would be like to do that. And they're like, oh, you can't do that. Lucas will sue you. And I'm like, I don't know about that. I mean, we'll see. But I'm like, I'd like to do something. And they're like, well, you know, how exciting could it really be? I mean, what are you going to do? Just go on stage and that's all? I'm like, no, I'd like to do something with vocals, with the story, with characters, with sound that's coming from speakers and not just the little sabers themselves. Although at the time I didn't even know you could make sabers that even lit up at all and make sound.
Yeah, these are awesome.
Right. I mean, so these, it's come a long way, baby, as they would say. So I built this one in particular myself. I actually build all of my own sabers, but I call this one the Flange 5 saber. It's gone through some iterations or whatnot, and even the blade's a new blade. It's called a photon blade, and it's made by my friends at Vader's Vault, so shout out to them. But normally this saber is actually blue. It has a blue, and white LED kind of array. There's a sort of 3 up in a little triangle. So the 2 blues normally light up. Then when I hit like a button down here, the white one normally lights up. Now right now, you won't see very much difference, but normally...
There went a little blue.
Yeah, you'll see 2 blue LEDs lit, then when I hit the button it becomes very white. This blade, for whatever reason, and I'm still not sure how it exactly works, it pretty much converts all the blue light into, as you can see, a lot more green light. And I'm not sure how it'll come out on the camera, it'll probably be very bright white. But it's very much a very pretty green, you know. But in any case, yeah, building the sabers has become a big part of something I need to do for my productions, although I still don't do it for sale. But over the years, over these past 10 years, a lot of companies have popped up like Vader's Vault. I should give plenty of shout outs. There's Genesis Custom Sabers, my man Rob Petcow, who's in Canada, great saber company and, you know, just a great builder. And most of these people are like these Star Wars fans too. So they're not generally just businessmen. They're usually these Star Wars fans who started off as, I want to say, hobbyists, and then kind of transitioned into building it into a little bit more of a business and really getting into the nitty gritty of, well, we're going to custom design this saber here, and we're going to custom machine this part, and this is going to be here, and we're going to use this more powerful LED. And anyways, kind of transitioning back to the 2005, there was none of this. There was none of this. It was all totally brand new. This lightsaber building community was completely underground, and a lot of the technologies just weren't there. And I hate to make it sound like George Lucas in some ways, but it's true. Like back in 1977, George Lucas was like, I don't have the technologies that I want in order to get the TIE fighters to fly through space and the Millennium Falcon to be looking like it's not, you know, just a thing on a string hanging in front of a space background. So what did he have to do? He had to build the facilities and the resources and all this kind of stuff. And his background in animation and model work really helped him a lot. So with the Sabers, the reason that I even came aboard this whole thing is I wanted to do a live project. So I started researching on the internet, and I'm like, hey, does anyone know about lightsaber products? I hadn't heard about anything at the time. Finally, someone told me about the Master Replicas Force Effects line of sabers, and again, this is kind of going back. We could probably pop up old pictures of these kinds of things, but at the time, a company called Master Replicas was licensed by Lucasfilm to build somewhat accurate movie props, things that look like the Luke Graflex saber, things that look like the kind of Highland Graflex or whatever they call it, Highland saber. I may be getting that wrong. Sorry, super accurate Star Wars guys. But Vader's saber and so forth, and even the Obi-Wan style one, which has more like a, you know, the grenade grip and these very specific parts. So they made these somewhat accurate props, but they were functional and they had the batteries and they had the sound and they lit up really nice. But anyways, over time, we all kind of found that they weren't really good for fighting. And they weren't particularly bright. They were bright, but just not really like, boom, in your face, super, super bright. So what happened is sort of this underground lightsaber community, they started converting these sabers. They'd take out the electronics and put them into better hilts, something lightweight, something more feasible for the hands. And also they would take these LED tubes that were made by Master Replicas, which had an LED array in it. So basically there was just a string of LEDs. The problem is it was a systemic failure, not failure, but it's like if you struck that against things, it would damage that LED string. And someone might say, well, what if you repair it? I'm like, well, but then you bang it against something and it still damages it. So it's a systemic problem. You could repair it as many times as you want, you're still going to break it. So that's what was going on. The community was like, well, how do we do this? And they put the LED inside the actual hilt. And the light was just very, very bright, one single LED for the most part, and it would drive all the way through the tube. And that's actually how these, again, work. I mean, I'll show you this kind of thing. This is a completely different blade, kind of going all over the place here with my explanations. But so I would just pop this out, and that's what this little screw is here for. You know, obviously, there's other bolts to hold other things in, but I could literally, if I had the time here, and we don't want to waste all the video time, unscrew this, thunk, just pop the blade out, throw it down. Just like this is a completely different type of blade. This is made by my man Gary Ripper of Ripper Sabers, and you probably won't be able to see that, but maybe we'll show some close-ups later. It's just a hand-etched, very beautiful acrylic blade.
It's beautiful.
Totally different prop. Someone might say, that's not a lightsaber, and I'd be like, well, you'd be correct, but it doesn't have to be. And that brings me to another concern with it is the sounds. So for example, I'll go ahead and just show you how this works. I can boot this into a menu mode. Okay, with this board in here that's called the Crystal Focus Sound and Light Driver board by Plector Labs, a good friend of mine. Shout out to Irv. Woo-hoo. So I'll boot it into a menu. So it's hard for probably the viewers to hear, but it said Episode 5 Remastered, and I do all this sound work. That was actually my voice coming through all these little menu modes and all this kind of music and stuff. But that kind of shows you what sounds were in here previously. It sounds a little bit more like a lightsaber, but... Elemental Ice. So it says Elemental Ice. What the hell is that, right? So we hold down the button. Okay, so now it's basically selected this completely different sound set. So you can think of it like there's several banks. In this case, this can hold up to 6 banks, although there's other versions of the board that can hold more or less or whatever. But now it won't sound like a lightsaber at all. It'll just sound interesting and cool.
Wow.
So, probably difficult for the audience to hear fully what's going on, but this was just sort of my own interpretation of what do I think, what would an ice sword sound like? Because you kind of go like, hey, what does ice sound like? And you're like, well, it sounds like, wait a minute, yeah, nothing. So, this is just kind of like swing noises that it would have. And then, of course, collision, you go like, well, what would that sound like?
Nice.
Like shattering.
To a point. And it's probably going to be hard to hear, but you can hear a pitch change.
Cool.
It's really cool.
Really hard to detect. And of course, just different little modes that you can put on it. The button does different kind of noises. And then turning it off. So it's a completely different, in a way, a reimagination of what a lightsaber would sound like. Or you could just imagine it like a sword. So there's many different sound, we call these sound fonts. And of course, they all have different swing noises, collision data, or whatever sound, and power on, off, and lots of different other things.
It's a lot like programming a video game.
To a point, exactly. And it has to be crafted in a very certain way so that the sounds end up organic. Because as you can imagine, the board here is driving it and it's having to figure out what sounds to play at a certain time. And if you didn't do it right, it would sound, jumpy and non-organic. So there's just a lot to it, So even when we talk about going back to like what got me started, it was all just I wanted to make a live performance. That's all. With 10 people, I grabbed a bunch of people from the community, just basically held some auditions, and said, hey, we're going to do this live Star Wars performance. Who wants to try to help me out with it? I paid everybody a small stipend. It's very minimal. Nobody really cared about it either. They weren't like interested in the money. They just wanted to be a part of the project. But I was kind of like, I want to give back as much as I can because I understand what it means to put this much time into it. So we spent not quite a year working on it, but something like that, rehearsing once, sometimes twice a week, and then finally we were ready to present it. And that was finally 2006, and I launched it, and then the community was like, oh my gosh, this is really cool, and I kind of got my name from that Novastar because the character that I portrayed in there of my own writing was a character named Greytail Novastar. And people are like, where the hell did that come from? And I've got my background on why and where and all that stuff, but for the most part it was just sounded very Star Warsy. In a way, I can give a little sideline that I actually brought two names of two characters from one of my old favorite cartoons as a kid, which was called Star Blazers, if anybody's familiar with it, Yamato in Japan. But anyways, there was the characters of Nova and Wildstar, so I just kind of put those together and I came up with that.
So the Ice Blade, is that designed off of anything?
Right, so the ice sounds, they were pretty much out of my own imagination. What happened was, when I first ran into Irv Plechter, PlechterLabs.com, and he's the one who built this lightsaber driver board called Crystal Focus. So that's like the heart, the electronics, the circuit board that runs everything. What was going on is he was allowing people to be able to put on their sounds. And you could do this by a little SD card that was in there, which is now a micro SD card. But in any case, I was like, interesting. Well, I guess we should maybe create some different kind of sound profiles and these kinds of things. Because at first when Irv designed the board, he really only put some basic sounds on there to kind of just get the concept across, and everybody's excited, wow, that's cool. But there really wasn't any kind of library of anything yet. So I sort of was pretty much one of the original pioneers, if not the original pioneer, but I can't really be sure of that, of the idea of having a very themed sound font package. At first, everything was really Ben Burt kind of style sounds. Big shout out to Ben Burt. He's a huge inspiration, obviously, of creating these robust sounds that just really are now timeless. When you think of lightsaber, the first thing you can hear, you hear that power on.
Yeah, for sure.
The buzz and the hums. But in any case, so most of the sounds were all just lightsaber, lightsaber, lightsaber. So one of the first things that I created before we really get to the Ice Sword was something called Ancient Saber. And I don't have that font installed on this saber here, but it's kind of like what you would imagine. Is I decided what would a lightsaber that was made sort of like, what would the first lightsaber have sounded like, or one that just was really the prototype, or just one that sucks, I don't know. And I wanted to make this because I wanted people to kind of start to branch a little bit past being like, we only want to hear Ben Burt sounds. Not that it's bad, but I was like, I'm sure we can do more. So that went off actually really well, and because I was like, this could be a disaster. Everybody would say, what? This is some garbage. I don't want to hear that. I want to hear lightsaber sounds. And who knows? They could have all jettisoned all that stuff and said we don't want that. But a lot of people liked it. And by the way, if you want to learn more about all these kind of sound fonts that I design, and also other designers now, you visit SaberCombat.com, which is pretty cool. And this library of sounds is actually even in a way useful for people if they want to do fan films.
Is there a link to that on your website?
There is actually, yeah. So you can
Cool.
see the links there at SaberCombat.com, and again, SaberFont is the website for the fonts. But then, kind of transitioning back to what you said about the ice blade, what happened is I just started saying, well, let me think how my imagination will work. I'm like, well, what if we make an ice sword? I want to make a fire sword. I'll do all the elements. And what happened? After that I went, how about a water style sword? How about an earth sword? Earth elemental is really what I kind of, made it more like. Because I was like, what's an earth sword? Doesn't sound like anything. Dirt? What does dirt sound like? But so I kind of, just kind of played with my imagination a little, and I said, well, how many different ways can we have a prop that would be really cool? I even made one which is installed in there, but it won't make much sense if I turn it on now, a light whip. So,
oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so you get this kind of arcing, so it sounds like little circuits arcing, and of course when you actually whip it, you get that feeling that you're doing more, not just a leather whip, so you hear that, but it's more of that sizzling snap, like if it was this arcing whip of energy. And again, a lot of these, some people would say, well, what the hell would that really sound like? I'm like, I have no idea, because none of these things exist. Probably Ben Burtt was in a very similar position, because, when George Lucas went, well, I need you to make this thing, and it's got to sound like a lightsaber. He was probably like, what the hell's a lightsaber? Like, what does that do? Like, oh, it's a light, so it's made purely out of light. It's not just steel with energy around it. He probably had to ask all these questions and get with George and have him explain it. Oh, they come out. They don't just unsheathe like they're out of the scabbard. They literally come out empty, and then on they go. So all these kinds of things probably had to cross sound designers' minds. And I'm not trying to say I would know. I'm not a professional sound designer in any way, shape, or form. But I sort of design out of my imagination and say, like, what could this sound like? Well, how do we get people's minds to understand what it is I'm trying to accomplish just with sound? Ice Sword was actually a great example too, because I wanted it when people turned it on. I mean, you don't really have any visuals sometimes. You listen to sounds and be like, well, what is that? I wanted it where if I designed a sound font, I wanted it where as they heard it, they'd be like, oh, that's cool. It sounds like an old saber. I'm like, that's ancient saber. As opposed to having to be told. If you turn it on, they go, what is that? I mean, it sounds cool, but what is it? Oh, well, it's this thing. It's kind of like, I'm not trying to say it defeats the purpose, but it's sort of like you want people to almost organically be like, oh yeah, that sounds like a fire sword, And sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder. As you can imagine, like I'm mentioning, a fire sword, it's relatively, I don't want to say easy, but it's like we understand this idea, the sound of an inferno. Granted, when you have your fireplace going, it really doesn't sound like much. You get a little popping and cracking, but you don't hear this,
like a flamethrower.
Right, so you have to kind of pick and choose about, well, what is this going to sound like? Ice was one of the hardest ones I've ever done too, because I asked some of my friends while I was designing it, I'd be doing stuff, I'm like, hey, what does ice sound like to you? And they're like, well, it's like a hammer cracking ice. I'm like, besides that. They had nothing, and it's true. I almost had nothing, So I know I'm kind of going on and on about this, but there's sort of an art form to sound design, and so I kind of brought that aboard the Saber process. I think it's one of the most important things, and even George Lucas used to mention it when he talked about the movies. He said, I think that the sound and the music is 70% of the film. He used to credit John Williams and Ben Burtt in a giant way, because imagine Star Wars on mute.
Yeah,
it's there. It'll be exciting to see the Millennium Falcon, but you'd probably be there going, you'd be making sounds. And even now, it's so programmed in our brains. If you watch Star Wars on mute, I bet you would already be hearing the sounds in your mind. But imagine if you'd never heard them. Or imagine, and I'm kind of going into a weird tangent, but think about if the sounds were really cheesy, like really bad. Like, back in the 70s, a lot of people tried to emulate, or even, maybe even came before George Lucas and made these just awful, pew, 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 chung, chung, and just bad sound effects where you're like, yeah, it just doesn't immerse you in this world. It makes it just sound like they're trying to make fun of themselves. And it never felt like that. I think we can all agree. Maybe other people would not. I don't know. But that the sounds were very immersive. It made you feel like you were really in another place, another planet, another dimension. And that's really what I wanted from these kind of sound fonts, is that you turn on the Saber and it really like lives. It feels organic, and it doesn't feel like a absolutely cheesy, you know, kind of like, oh, okay, I see a lightsaber, great, nicely done. So I didn't want it to sound anything like maybe the toys in the stores where there not much effort's put in. You know, they just go, well, that sounds cool, throw it in there and go like, there you go, their lightsaber. And you're like, I personally don't think that's how Ben Burtt was doing it. Even when he was probably crafting the sounds for things like Empire Strikes Back and well, all of the films, he there's some interviews you can catch with him where he explains how, you know, at one point I need to have the light side hum kind of more volume here when Obi-Wan is talking, then it goes back to Vader, you should not have come back, or whatever, and so the dark side hum kind of overtakes there, and then this thing, he says, we're further away here, but then they're closer here, and then the popping sound of when they're, you know, locked up. He tried to explain how, like, it's like a symphony. It's not just, oh, put that sound here, this sound, same sound, oh, this is this one. It's like this blending and organic mishmash.
So we're really Star Wars focused today, clearly, as you can see, but as we know, Novastar has some sound fonts that aren't Star Wars related and a really interesting sort. So I'd love to know more about the other characters that you've created.
Oh, right, okay, so yeah, there's other aspects to what I do, that's for sure. So in addition to doing just Star Wars-y sound fonts and just Star Wars kind of stuff in general, you know, I can also make like I made a steel sword sound font where it's just literally, you know, ching, you know, so that's a little bit less of a Star Wars style thing. I've made kind of a kung fu font for fun. You know, it had a little bit of kung fu old style music, and you hear the whole wah Bruce Lee and the kind of overly large, you know, kind of punch noises. So that was kind of the aspect. I always wanted to say, well, what if, you know, you could put gloves on, you know, and do the with the electronics board, so it doesn't have to be a lightsaber. I even did a boxing sound font, you know, where you hear the ding ding ding, and you hear the crowd, you know, and they're punching, you hear the crowd going woo, and the gloves hitting the exactly, just for fun. And so like that's just some of the other aspects that I do. So my background's not entirely about Star Wars. I'm a fencer. I've done plenty of martial arts. I'm a performer. You know, I've been in theater for many years. So the aspect of costuming also comes into play as well. And actually, that is how we met.
Exactly.
I was lucky enough and blessed enough to be teaching some lightsaber classes at Google. So, you know, shout out to Google. And Kimber found out about the classes and came in as a student. And so as she was learning more and having fun, etc., then we finally came up to this one sort of like the closing class of that season, or however you want to say it. And I was like, hey guys, I think I want to, let's do something special where people can come and suit up in costume, get some pictures, maybe shoot some footage of you guys fighting, whatever you want to do, and I'll do the Vader thing. And everybody's like, what? You can suit up as Lord Vader? And yeah, what happened is some years ago, I met this one old veteran of the sword. His name is Christopher Villa, and he's got at least 40 plus years experience in sword work. He also looks a lot like Obi-Wan Kenobi, looks a lot like Alec Guinness. And what had happened, we were, you know, constantly meeting and talking about sword and this, that, and the other, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, at one point he said, you know, well, one of my dreams is to do the Obi-Wan fight versus Vader. I went, oh, really? Really? Okay, well, maybe we'll have to consider that. And we had considered using some other folks and associates that we know. Gary Ripper is another one. I mentioned him earlier. Gary makes these blades, which I showed you earlier. But anyways, Gary also suits up as Vader. But he's so far away. He lives entirely further away from my associate Christopher Villa. And so I was like, I don't know if it's going to be possible to get you guys together, teach you guys the sword work, you know, that, you know, the movie choreography, and get it all performed. So Chris was like, why don't you do it, Matthew? And I'm like, what? Me as Vader? Are you kidding? I'm a very short guy. I'm actually about 5'7". And that doesn't make sense. It doesn't do justice to the Vader character. So over time, and I'll try to make it short because I'm already going on and on, I thought a lot about it and I went, I think I can pull this off in a couple of cheats. I can raise myself up on, not platforms because it looks too ridiculous, you look like a velociraptor walking around, but on lifts. elevator shoes, basically, where my feet are very much at an angle. But I could still fight and move in them. And not easy, but I could do it. And I did a cheat with my helmet where I'm actually looking through Vader's, I want to say it's a diamond grill, is the best way. It's normally where his mouth would be. His eyes are here, and then he has that very iconic, the Vader mask. But I'm actually looking through that. The irony is that gives me several advantages. One is the added bonus of height, so I end up about 6'3", which is pretty ridiculous. I mean, when you're 5'7" and then you can become 6'3", that's a lot of excess height. I also make my shoulders wider. The shoulders are technically up higher, and just the whole scale makes me look like I'm a real, legit, bigger man. The legitimate Vader, by the way, it was David Prowse, who was a bodybuilder at the time, and he was ridiculously tall. I think he was 6'5" or 6'6", something like that. And he was, he was built. He was a bodybuilder. I am not. I'm a much smaller, athletic guy. So this transition of making the right scale for a character is very important. So I was able to pull off this fight with Christopher Villa, and we have some footage of that, and people can find that online. You can look through my channel and all these different videos. We even recreated live the Empire Strikes Back battle, although at that one I wasn't Vader, I was Luke, not to be confusing. But in any case, that's kind of how the Vader costume came about, and that brings you down this crazy rabbit hole. Because doing the Vader costume, I'm not going to lie to you guys, is very complicated.
So complicated.
It takes a lot of work, and it really depends on how far you want to take it. I wanted to have good vocals and sounding. I wanted to have it where I could trigger James Earl Jones quotes. So
That's so awesome.
it was a lot of fun, and we could probably even cut footage on that, or people could look it up on the channel. But I literally have it where if I have my hand in my belt like Vader, very iconic pose for David Prowse, and even Bob Anderson, who was the champion, and so we did all the fight work. In any case, I could trigger a button. It's like where you press it, and you go, "Don't know the power of the dark side." And instead of it just being me lowering my voice, which is not good enough, it's close but not good enough, it's really James Earl Jones, and the speakers are mounted up here on my shoulders. I'm literally holding desktop speakers up there.
Dang.
So they're extremely loud, and I didn't do that just to be silly. I just went, well, how will people hear it? If you just have a little tiny speaker, that would be, even in the lightsabers, it's just not as audible. It doesn't sound like someone's voice resonating. So that doesn't work. And certainly not, some people have even said, well, I do my breathing with a cell phone. I'm like, well, that's great, but you just really can't hear it. Now with this, you literally, while I walk in the door, you hear this, everybody's like, oh my God, it's Vader, what in the world? I can trigger music, so if I hold the button, I can play the Imperial March. And also an additional thing that I added to the Vader costume is inside I have a mic, and then another speaker down here that's hidden under my chest armor, which is technically up high. That's why there's some space for me. And that is, I have attached and rewired a vocal changer. So it's able to get, if I speak in my deeper registers, it's helpful, but it also lowers my voice a few more pitches down, and then it starts to sound very much like Lord Vader. This isn't low enough, but when I do that combined with my vocal changer, it works really well. A lot of Vaders, there's a lot of Vaders out there, by the way, too. Big shout outs to all the Vaders that are in like the 501st. The 501st, by the way, is a non-profit organization of general Star Wars costumers, and there's all sorts of different people in it, but just to kind of focus on the Vaders, they do a lot of work. A lot of them spend a lot of time on being accurate, to the film, and it costs a lot of money for a lot of those guys. I don't have that kind of money, so just to kind of transition back to the way that I do things, my vocal changer, it was a $20 toy that I bought, and kind of messed with it. I pulled it apart, rewired it a little bit, put a much more robust speaker on it, and did some other little tiny things that are just not worth going into, but so that was able to achieve a decent result. It's not the best thing, but
it's really amazing how close it actually is.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good.
Really good.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I mean, that's the thing is, for me, it was, I wanted to do enough justice to the character and also have it robust enough for doing events. If I go up to a child and I go, "You don't know the power of the dark side," it just destroys the illusion and the image and the fun of it. and you don't want that. It's almost akin to, not to transition again, but like when you're fighting on stage, people don't think about how much work is involved in this, having it where you don't accidentally turn off your saber, because you look like a silly goose, you know? I mean, it's ridiculous. And it's not more out of pride, it's out of the idea of you want to immerse people in what you're doing. And once you start down the dark path, you draw them in and you keep them there. That's actually a huge part of theater and performance, and this idea of costuming in general. There are times when it's appropriate for you to break out of character and not be this. Like, I'll make jokes as Vader, even in the suit. I try to keep the voice and all that, but it's like, you know, when you're doing like a stage performance, you don't want the sabers to turn off, you don't want someone to trip and fall. If their cloak, you know, falls off halfway, like, you know, if I was like this while I was fighting, I mean, I guess the Jedi don't fight in this, but you know, this just destroys it. People go, oh look, honey, his cloak's, I wonder if he's going to be okay, or whatever. So there's so many little details that people don't understand or appreciate in those kinds of performances because they're used to film. If that happened in film, if Kimber's thing fell over here, we would we would cut it, right?
Hello, Obi-Wan.
You're my only hope. But right, we would have to edit this footage and say, cut, start again, this thing happened, the lamp fell over, or you did your lightsaber move wrong. You don't really have this ability sometimes to do that for live. You have to have everything be perfect.
A huge thank you to Novastar. Thank you for joining us. This is only part 1. Make sure you check out part 2, where we go into details about his SaberCombat system, his DVDs, as well as his new web series, The Power of the Fan Force. Also make sure you tune in weekly to Ricochet. You never know who we're going to have next.